Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Okay, today we're going to do something different. Hooray! Instead of book reviews, I'm going to actually go back and do some shorter concept podcasts. This might end up being 5 to 8 of these. I'm not real sure, but I've been stumbling across these ideas and sort of holding on to them. Now, all these concepts, they're somehow related or interrelated, and they mostly consider double binds, artificial polarization, and reversals and non-duality, things like that. Now, of course, let me know if you like this concept thing better or the book reviews better. Either way, the podcast has always served as a great place for me to dump the things that are in my head, sort of feed them back to you and to myself. Now, hopefully the ideas we're covering can really benefit you in your daily life and help you to recognize and have better tools to process the contradictions that you confront. Okay, I hope you enjoy the brevity. It's not too brev, just, a bit brevy, yeah? Part 1. Problems with the game. William James, in Pragmatism, he speaks of the middle road between the monists and the empiricists, the tough-minded and the tender-hearted. Or as Alan Watts likes to call them, the prickles and the goos. So the prickles are the animated skeletons of the overly intellectual. These are desiccated rationalists in conflict with the squishy, feely, experiential, expelling torrents of emotion goos. And of course, both sides need each other for the world to function properly, and for them to function. But of course, they're both confused by each other, so they lash out at each other. Now, these different types of people find grievance in the other simply because they're not alike. Which really sounds quite childish, right? Now, Watts says that, much like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, they have fallen for believing the game of black and white. The static Cartesian grid dictating moves to win and lose, us and them, off with their heads. And yet Alice refuses to play the game. So can we refuse to play the game? Can we just leave the egomaniacal queen or the president screaming? Perhaps continuing to play is exactly the problem. But Watts, of course, says life is a game. We must play. Our problem is when we forget that it's a game. This is when we get the ego involved. We must win. We must annihilate. However, before we commence annihilating, one thing we should remember with all competition is that it's usually rigged. Someone fixes the rules and metrics. These are really formalized into a law, and they're made into static things that are non-pliable for the players. Now, creativity ceases under competition, and subjugation and conformity begins. This sort of lack of creativity amidst competition is because we aren't making our own way. We're busily reacting and aligning our moves to theirs. Bishop to rook 4. But right, it really never was our game to begin with. We were captured and dropped into someone else's game. So imagine if we agreed living was actually the goal, not winning. But of course, the notion of living has also been captured by the game. We politic for life, we politic for security, we politic for our children, and we fear life as we know it would end. And with such things at stake, of course, we must win. But that's just believing the game again, because we keep thinking, off with their heads. Okay, I'm sure you probably have some objections there, because the thing about issuing Watts's kind of Buddhist pronouncements that are all about the illusory status of our foundational beliefs may not be overly helpful, right? And this is kind of this thing where what happens is a 15-year-old maybe just discovers a new concept. Maybe it's Marxism or feminism or even Buddhism, and they can explain to their CEO dad why he's the problem with the world. Now, it might be somewhat true, but it also may not change anything. And that can be a little bit sad, but mostly this is kind of a meta move where we conclude that reality sucks, but somehow we're all stuck in it and maybe complicit, but mostly we know that it's our dad's fault. However, if reality really is a cage, a given set of circumstances that we're born into, and we're mostly powerless, Well, maybe our only respite might be to return to a place of personal power. This would be the internal individual. This is where we move into the realm of ideas inside ourselves, where we manipulate personal perspectives and withdraw into abstraction. This becomes our own personal VR by which we interact with the world. Now, this can be seen as a kind of a critique of Kantianism that also sort of fits the post-structuralists. There's other philosophers, people like Heidegger or Jose Ortega y Gasset, and they talk about the game, or life, as this kind of social construct and circumstances into which we are bodily dropped from the birth canal. Now, these shape who we are, and it's almost like we're being born into a mold of maybe, I don't know what, like Mickey Mouse or the Mad Hatter or whomever, right? But our identity is highly dependent on circumstance. This pushes back against the Kantian or even Descartes kind of idea, because we're not and never can be only, I think, therefore I am, because it's not a binary between reason and nature. It is more accurately, I think, therefore I am in the world. And a shout out to Stephen West on Philosophize This for bringing that to my attention. And so, this 15-year-old, bitterly espousing the thwarted prophecy of Marxism, enraged over his circumstances, can at least check his father, and this is a pawn to king move. So this converts the ideological systemic conflict into interpersonal ammunition. So this is where you use the game to attack your nearest opponent. And this is a version of attempting to try out the power and utility of these ideas, to explode the local authority before expanding to explode the global hegemony.
The revolution is nigh, comrades. Off with the capitalist heads.
Part 2. The double bind. Alan Watts also brings up the double bind. This is when people say things like, be spontaneous, or be yourself, act naturally. Which is of course impossible, because the act is to perform naturalism, which is conformist normality, and it must be performed, right? And by performing, you're not actually ever being yourself. So socially, we're taught that being yourself is always a performative act. So we're in a system layered with these double binds. And these are really considered irreconcilable differences, or, at a minimum, these are kind of where the choices you're given are both undesirable. The outcomes would be undesirable for you no matter what. So it's when you receive things like conflicting messages at the same time as well, that leads to scenarios where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So, as an example, Slavoj Žižek, he has a book called Against the Double Blackmail, and he references the Paris riots of 2005, where the Minister of the Interior, Sarkozy, who later became president, he calls the immigrant populations animals, not apologizing for the police treating them as such. Now, there's naturally more going on, but let's consider this. The French imported labor, cheap immigrant labor for their luxury, and they relegated them to one specific community, creating a ghetto. Now here's the double bind. By playing along with the system and letting them take advantage of you, you acquiesce to being treated as inferior, as an animal. But if you rebel against the system, you're an ingrate who is not civilized. You are a barbaric animal. And so you prove you cannot be integrated into French society because you cannot follow the rules. Now, in this kind of double bind where you can't win either way, it starts building up as rage, and that forms into ressentiment. And when that's felt by these people, they embody these feelings as a physical, verbal message, right? Like they're saying, if you think we're animals, we'll give you animals. And they ended up burning their cars, and there was these riots, and they burned a portion of the ghetto down. Now, what this did is, for some people who wanted it to, it proved they were animals. Now, to others, this actually brought attention to the trap they were in. This was a reactionary cry for humanity and justice. Now, one issue that we encounter with capitalism is this type of double bind. It's almost everywhere, and any move you make seems to somehow be co-opted. So the famous example is if you're a rebellious young Elvis Presley. Well, all your rebellion and rage and charisma, your rage against the machine, is channeled and sold. And soon you become a polyester chubby guy wearing sparkles every night at Vegas. And this is the sellout Presley. Now, capitalism somehow works to absorb and literally capitalizes on all forms of energy. In fact, capital at some level is merely a measure of energy. So consider capitalism Kind of like an amoeba. I find this to be the best example because it absorbs everything, kind of like slime. Now, I've heard it called a hydra before, but I think slime is a better image. I think it's more totalizing. It just oozes along, digesting everything with really no heads to swing a sword at. But the double bind, when we kind of think about that, maybe the image is more like some sort of superhero rubber man, where you can lash out, but it uses your own force against you. Hey, stop hitting yourself. It's like an older brother. Now, within capitalism, this generates really complex tactics, such as repressive tolerance and artificial negativity, which we're going to talk about more next episode. But the challenge is, the system not only neutralizes your energies, it actually captures them and redirects them to not only punish you, but to sustain and benefit itself. Now, the illusion is, once again, the game we are offered is to imagine capitalism as a hydra. Please imagine that. And with a concerted attack, we could rally and we could all cut off the heads. Yeah, but it's a little more clever and harder than that. Because as Foucault says, power is diffused into systems, apparatuses, and assemblages, and we really don't even know how to combat them. So we're compelled to act, but there's no head to lop off. Part 3, Catch-22. The double bind is also known as a Catch-22, and this is based off the Joseph Heller novel. It's a black comedy published in 1961, really about war and the military and capitalism. Now, there's numerous examples in the book, but the main character encounters this one. The military promises you get to go home after flying 10 missions. Well, of course, our protagonist is under a lot of stress from really not understanding the war in general or what they're doing, and of course flying and having shells explode all around him and watching his buddies die. So then he's even more aghast to hear the commander keeps raising the number of missions every week, making it impossible for him to go home. The top brass, you see, yeah, they're competing with each other in petty little rivalries. Now, the only way out of this death trap might be to plead insanity. But here's the paradox, the double bind, if you will. According to military policy, if you want to get out of combat, well, that's completely sane. To be insane would be to want to stay and fight. Now, if you're sane enough to want to live, you technically cannot be insane. Thus, of course, when our protagonist just loses his mind, he finally gives up, ceasing to care, and he just stops wearing pants anymore. The military is like, all right, and they just award him for his bravery. Now, this type of double bind with insanity, yeah, that's the preferred outcome. It seems to really sort of originate in military management and bureaucracy, but of course it's transferred and flourished quite well in industrial capitalism, and now it's moved into cognitive labor and politics. Oh, and by the way, it's a perfect fit for the prison and healthcare systems. In Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Randall Murphy is caught in a bureaucratic loop, where to avoid one fate, which is prison, he pretends insanity. But in so doing, he unwittingly revokes his welfare from the state into the hands of a petty tyrant named Nurse Ratched, who, with a tight-lipped smile, and for his own good of course, works to break this spirited, spontaneous man. Of course, again with Foucault, the body can be held captive, but that's not enough anymore. The true target of Nurse Ratched's machinations is his head. The apparatus of power hides and moves through bureaucratic machinations. It forces the internalization of no-win, double-bind, contradictory, coercive surrender scenarios. So, we're forced into the Red Queen's farcical game. And as we internalize it, we become sane in our mutual insanity. Off with your own head. All right, thank you very much for listening. Please don't damage your head or anyone else's, right? This is merely kind of a foundational context as we move into really discovering some alternate ways to consider and potentially break out of this kind of dynamic double-bind system. Our next episode is on artificial negativity and repressive tolerance, and we're going to maybe touch a little bit on territorialization and deterritorialization. Now, the first two ideas are fairly new to me, and I just wanted to share them with you as they sort of discuss penetrating through these double binds, or at least comprehending the straw man targets whose metaphorical heads we are trying to chop off. Okay, if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us. It really helps. And if you're looking for more information, such as written versions of the show, YouTube links, how to help out, anything like that, please check out letusthinkaboutit.com. This is Ryder Richards signing off. Until next time, stay safe.